everyone, my name's Christy. Welcome to my corner. Thank you for joining me today on this Tuesday where I want to talk about the 5 things that I wish I knew when I started doing embroidery. And these are things that not only make my finished pieces better, but they also make them more fun to stitch. And I feel like if my embroidery isn't fun to stitch, if I don't enjoy doing it, there's no point in me doing it because I have a job, right? Embroidery is not my job. And so being able to enjoy my stitching and have it be an enjoyable hobby and also have a better product has really helped me. And these 5 things that you all might already know are things that I didn't know and I want to share with you. Several of these will be useful for cross stitch as well, but I'm going to focus on how they help me in my embroidery because that's what I know. I'm a baby cross stitcher and I would not presume to give cross stitch advice, but I'll mention when it crosses over. The first thing I wish I'd known when I first started is that quality matters. And for this, I'm particularly talking about 3 things: thread, needle, scissors. Those 3 things, you need at least medium quality item. Let's talk floss first. When I say that you need a quality floss, I'm not saying you have to go out and buy expensive silks or expensive overdyes or expensive hand-dyed floss. DMC is a good medium grade floss that is easy to stitch with, it looks nice when it ends, and it's readily available. I think DMC holds 60% of the floss market, and many overdyed and hand-dyed flosses use a DMC white base. I am in no way knocking DMC. It is the floss I use the most, and it is the floss that I chart all of my embroidery designs in because it's readily available, at least in North America, especially the US, and most of Europe. Another mid-grade thread that I've never used, but I hear good things about is anchor threads. And I hear Cosmo is a little bit more expensive, but not so expensive, and also a good quality floss. So these are kind of mid-grade flosses that are readily available that you can use. What you want to avoid are the bulk flosses like this, where you can get 20, 40, 100 skeins of floss for $5, $10, $15. This entire bucket of floss, this is my garbage floss bucket. This entire bucket of floss, I think cost me $15. And it's this Prism brand that I got at Joann Fabrics. I didn't know how bad it was. And you can stitch with it, but it's not fun. It knots, it breaks, it just doesn't lay right. It's hard to thread, just all sorts of different issues with it. And so this floss is good for making friendship bracelets and pom-poms. It is not good for doing embroidery. So basically, if you can buy it in bulk for a ridiculously cheap price, it's probably not very good floss, and you want to save that for things like pom-poms and friendship bracelets. And the nice thing about this sort of medium level of floss, like DMC, like Anchor, is that it is relatively inexpensive. You may not be able to buy a whole range at once, or if you're kitting up a very large project, you may not be able to buy it all at once, but you can at least buy it in little pieces. And I know for me, DMC thread costs 59 cents a skein. And that is a really good price, and it's pretty inexpensive. Next, I want to talk about needles. And needles are a bit more difficult because the widely available needles are DMC needles, at least in my craft stores. And I gotta be honest, I don't love DMC needles. And so I highly recommend springing for slightly higher than DMC grade needles. And I have a whole video about needles that I'll put up here or up here. I think up here. I think that's where it shows up. When I did a test of different kinds of needles, and what I discovered is that spending a little bit more on needles will really make your stitching more enjoyable because it'll be easier to thread. One of the main problems I think new stitchers have is that threading a needle is actually quite difficult at first because you're trying to get a floppy string through a very small needle, because you of course want to use a needle that's only slightly larger than the thread, so that way you don't have a big hole going through your fabric. And this means that threading the needle can be difficult. So you want to make sure that your needle is of a good quality. And the 2 kind of upper mid-range that I really like are John James needles, which are made in England, and Boa needles, which I think are made in France. Tulip needles are a bit more expensive, and they're actually my favorites, and they are made, I believe, in Japan. So there are a range of needles. DMC is good enough, but I find it shreds my thread whereas Bowen, John James, and then tulip needles are a little bit more expensive, relatively speaking, but make stitching so much more enjoyable. And finally, when it comes to quality, I want to talk about scissors. I love tiny embroidery scissors. I have an embroidery scissor collection right here, and they make me very happy. And you can get embroidery scissors in all different shapes and sizes, and they can be really fun to collect. But you want to make sure that they're sharp, and you want to make sure at least you have one pair of scissors that has a sharp tip. My first pair of scissors that I ever got, I got at Michael's. I don't remember what brand they were, but I think they were like a DMC brand, essentially. They were small and they were brass looking, right? They had sort of golden handles and they worked great. I have subsequently lost them. They're probably in a chair somewhere, but they were perfectly fine. I think they were $7 or $8, totally worth it. I could have stitched my entire stitching life with those and been perfectly happy. Small scissors from like Fiskars are also very good. And then you can kind of, if you want to build a collection, build a collection. But sometimes the ones that are super cute, like this pair of stork scissors that were a souvenir from a trip to Spain, are adorable and I love them and I'm glad I have them. I don't use them. They're not sharp enough. They don't have a very sharp point. That's not very sharp, and so you can't really get in really close to your stitching. A brand of scissors I really like is Ginger, and as you can see, they're really sharp, and these are really nice, but you don't have to have really nice scissors. You just have to have sharp scissors, and you can get those for pretty inexpensive at your local craft store. So those are the 3 basic items of stitching that I feel like you might want to spring a little bit for quality. And this doesn't mean you have to spend a ton of money. It just means that you want to be conscious of the brands that you're choosing. And mainstream brands you can get everywhere are perfectly good. There's a reason why DMC holds 60% of market share when it comes to embroidery floss. It's because they have a good quality embroidery floss. Number 2, most of you know this. If you have been stitching for very long, if you have been sewing for very long, you know that thread has a direction. There is a way that thread wants to go through fabric and through the eye of a needle. And you can tell by pulling it through back and forth and seeing which way pulls better. And for this piece of thread here, it pulls better going up like that, which means that this is the end I want to put through my needle and through my fabric because it's smoother. And that's just through the process of spinning embroidery floss. You have a right way and a wrong way. And I can tell, and I have pretty damaged fingers. I have a really bad habit that I've had for 30 years, of gnawing on my fingers essentially. And so I don't have a lot of nerve endings in my fingers anymore. And I can still feel the difference. And it's easier in this. This is, I think, 4 strands. It's easier in a wider piece, obviously, than if it was just 1 strand, but I can tell in 1 strand too. And I highly recommend that before you thread your needle, you test and see which way's better. Most people know that. That I think is fairly common thread knowledge. But what you might not know is number 3, that needles also have a direction. So if you're trying to thread your needle and you just can't get the floss through the needle, check to make sure your thread is going in the right direction, but also flip your needle around, because when needles are made, the hole is stamped out. And so the hole goes in a direction, and you basically want to thread the needle in the direction that it was stamped out, and your floss will flow through the needle easier. So that's something that I don't know that everyone knows, and I just wanted to let you know, so now you can be less frustrated, because like I said, threading the needle is often something that is really frustrating for beginner stitchers. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, I think also apply to cross stitching. I haven't done a test of different cross stitching needles, but I imagine that they are created in a similar way. And I know that when you buy really high quality embroidery and cross stitching kits, you get good floss of DMC quality or higher. You get good needles, John James needles or Bowen needles. And although they don't usually include scissors, we all need good scissors to cut those threads. Number 4 is that fabric weave matters. And it matters when you are picking the thread you use, the needles you use, and what you want to do with that project. For example, if you have a very tightly woven fabric, you'll need to use a smaller needle and smaller threads, 1 or 2 strands of DMC, for example, because you want to make sure you can actually pull it through the fabric. If you can't pull it through the fabric, that causes a lot of problems. You also want to make sure that you choose a fabric that's appropriate for what you want to make out of it. So if you are making a really beautiful embroidery on a flimsy fabric that you then decide you want to have on a bag, like you want it to be the side of a bag, you've chosen the wrong fabric. Unless you can applique it in some way onto a heavier fabric, you can't use like a cotton muslin, for example, on the side of a bag. It just won't hold up to wear. So for me, I like a linen, a cotton linen blend, or a cotton fabric. And I use everything from a cotton muslin to a nice thick cone of cotton to canvas fabrics. Essentially, what I always say is you can stitch on anything you can get your needle through. You just want to make sure it's appropriate for the needle, the thread, and the end purpose. Knits can be a bear, but you can do it. You can stitch on a t-shirt or on even a sweater. You might want to practice on something easier first, but you can stitch on all of these things. And you need to find what works best for you in your stitching. Number 5 deals with how you transfer your design onto fabric. And I very quickly realized that you didn't have to buy patterns for embroidery. You could use any kind of pattern, a coloring book, an image that you found online. You could draw your own patterns. You could draw from pictures, right? As long as you somehow get that image onto fabric, you can then stitch it. I very quickly learned about heat erasable pens. And in particular, I like friction pens. I think they're very good and I use them a lot. What I didn't know when I first started, and what I think has caused some problems for pieces that are no longer in my hands, is that the heat erases the ink, but the cold makes it come back. And it needs to be cold, like freezing cold. But this means that if you have an embroidery that you make and you sell or you send to someone as a gift, say for Christmas in the Northern Hemisphere, when it's cold, those lines can come back, and in fact, often will come back. And I participated in a community stitch that I sent it to Canada in the winter, and all the mistakes that I had made when I was drawing that on the fabric were visible when she posted it to social media. And that's a real shame. So make sure when you are using things like a friction pen that you're going to stitch over those lines, because they're going to come back if the piece gets too cold. And I really regret not realizing that when I first started stitching. And this is especially true for me with cross stitching because I grid my fabric using a friction pen. So if I ever decide to send those pieces somewhere cold, when it's cold, those lines will come back and I'll basically have lines running through my cross stitch pieces as well. So those are my 5 things I wish I had known when I first started embroidery. Were there any of these that were new to you? Please let me know down below. Are there any that you think could be added to this list? Is there anything that you have discovered in your stitching that you wish other people knew to make their stitching more enjoyable as well? Let me know in the comments. If this was helpful and you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. I love talking about my stitching, and I look forward to seeing you in my Friday floss tube update. So with all that being said, please take good care of yourselves and have a good one. Bye.